Welcome to this lecture, which is kind of got two main parts to it. It comes from two different chapters, but they're related. And hopefully by the time you're done with this lecture, you can see why these two topics are related. The first topic we're going to discuss is learning how to reduce and enlarge formulas. So we're going to adjust formulas or recipes when we want to compound an amount different than that specified in the recipe or the formula to begin with. Secondly, and distinct but related, is this idea of how to calculate an active amount of drug from an actual drug moiety. So when there's a larger salt or a larger variation of the molecule, we can correlate the amount of active drug within this larger drug moiety. And what ties them all together is both of these types of calculations really just involve proportions, understanding how to use proportions to convert from one thing to another thing. And that really is the same for both of those. So we will kind of combine both of these chapters together, or those two different chapters together. So let's get started. The first topic we are going to discuss is reducing and enlarging formulas. Okay, so a little bit of background is that, and the reason that this is important is that a compounding pharmacist can work in a couple of different places. You could work in a community pharmacy. If you're working in a community pharmacy, then the batches or the amount of compound that you need to prepare on a daily basis is relatively small. You usually only compound what's needed for an individual patient. On the other hand, there are compounding pharmacists that work in institutions or hospitals. So there you have a lot of patients in your hospital. So you're not going to just make this in this compound or this drug product for a specific patient. You're going to need to have enough compound for those number of patients that you see on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. So you're compounding for multiple patients to be able to provide this compound for everyone in your institution or in your hospital. Compare that then to some of the formulas that are needed by pharmaceutical manufacturers or that basically mass produce their product for wholesale distribution. So clearly the ways they go about it, their good manufacturing practices and so forth are very different than a local pharmacy. But in the end, their formulas that they need, the batches that they produce at one time are much, much larger than you would have even in a hospital, or certainly much more than you would see for an individual patient. So again, formulas to make products will vary depending on what their intent was. Whoever wrote that formula might have been an individual pharmacist who, therefore, in a hospital, you need to scale that formula up. Or maybe you're getting a formula, for example, from the United States Pharmacopoeia's National Formulary, so the USPNF. Is a book that has many recipes for compounds that have been made for many years, and they're kind of standardized. Oftentimes, the USPNF formulas, for example, are standardized per 1,000 milliliters or 1,000 grams of the product, and which is nice to standardize them, but it means you always usually have to adjust the amounts from that formula to what you're making. So smaller if you're doing it for an individual patient, or maybe having to bump that recipe up or that formula up if you're doing it for a large number of patients, say in a hospital. Okay, so the point being that regardless of where you practice, oftentimes the formula or the recipe that you have to compound your specific product is not going to be for the exact amount that you may want to prepare for this particular batch. So therefore, you must be able to adjust it. And again, the key message is that regardless of the quantity to prepare, the correct proportions of one ingredient to the other in the given formula must be maintained. So even though you need to make more of it or maybe less of it, the relative amounts of one ingredient to the other ingredient, meaning the proportions of one ingredient to the other ingredient, must be maintained as you scale the recipe either up or the recipe down. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and do some sample problems so you can see that in action. The first problem reads, how much of each ingredient would be required to prepare 200 15 milliliter bottles of the following eardrops? So in this example, picture us more of a manufacturer who's trying to make a large batch of this product. So let's look at the actual recipe that we have, or the basic formula we have in the prescription calls for ciprofloxacin, which is an antibiotic. It's the active ingredient here. So of ciprofloxacin, we want 1 gram to be mixed with propylene glycol, 50 milliliters, and enough glycerin such that the total volume of all ingredients of the ciprofloxacin, propylene glycol, and glycerin, the total volume of everything would be 100 milliliters. Okay, so that's the formula we have. Doubtful that's not enough to prepare the amount that was requested in the problem. We want to be able to use that formula to prepare 215 milliliter bottles of these eardrops. So obviously, we're going to need to recalculate the amounts of each of these ingredients to create the batch that we want. So where do we start? Well, let's start by actually determining the volume of our batch. This idea of 215 milliliters bottles is too nonspecific. Let's calculate a definitive volume. So let's start by taking the 200 bottles, multiplying it by the fact that we know that there are 15 milliliters for each bottle. That way bottles cancel. And if you take 200 times 15, you get a total volume of 3,000 milliliters. So clearly, and this is extremely important, the batch that we desire, we wish to make 3,000 milliliters. And the reason I keep emphasizing this desired amount is it's an important part for the next step. And this step 2 is an extremely important step. To adjust any of these recipes, you need to calculate an adjustment factor. And this is what's really important to remember. The adjustment factor will be equal to the desired amount that you want to prepare. How much do you want to make? And then divide that by the standard amount in the formula. Okay, so it's the amount you want divided by the amount that's specified in the formula. So in this example, what we just calculated was the amount that we want is actually 3,000 milliliters. But the amount in the formula, the amounts of each ingredient in the formula, is the amounts needed for a total volume of 100 milliliters. So the amount in the standard formula is 100 milliliters. So if you take 3,000 milliliters divided by 100 milliliters, you see that the units cancel, so our final value has no units, and 3,000 divided by 100 is 30. So our adjustment factor is 30. What does that mean? That means everything called for in the recipe the way it's written, we need 30 times that amount. We're making a larger batch. We are making a 30-fold larger batch, so we need to increase everything by a factor of 30. So that's our last step, is to apply this adjustment factor to each ingredient. Okay, this is where, though, you need to be very organized. So you'll notice I wrote out each ingredient, ciprofloxacin, propylene glycol, and glycerin, in the same way it's written in the prescription. So for each of those ingredients, let's just do one at a time. So for the ciprofloxacin, I need 1 gram. The recipe calls for 1 gram, and I included the units there. Because remember, my adjustment factor doesn't have units. It doesn't change the units. All it does is change the numeric value. So 1 gram times the adjustment factor, which we calculated to be 30, means that I need 30 grams. Remember to carry over the unit. So 30 grams would be needed for my revised batch volume. Okay, let's do the same thing for the propylene glycol. It called for 50 milliliters for the original prescription, but we're going to multiply that by our adjustment factor of 30. So 50 times 30 is 1,500, but remember to carry over the units, and the units for the propylene glycol were in milliliters. So we need 1,500 milliliters. And lastly, for the glycerin, it was glycerin QSAD to a total of 30 milliliters. To 100 milliliters. Let's take that 100 milliliters times our adjustment factor, which was 30. 100 times 30 is 3,000, and carry the same units, milliliters. So, but it's very important here that you understand the QSAD still applies, meaning we are not going to use 3,000 milliliters of glycerin. We're going to add enough glycerin so that the total volume is 3,000 milliliters, not just 3,000 milliliters of glycerin. So that's what I'm saying, is that as you apply this adjustment factor to change the numbers in the recipe, don't fundamentally alter the actual recipe. So we're done with this question. To summarize, to make the batch that we want, since we want to make 30,000 milliliters versus what's called for in the prescription which is 100 milliliters, we've decided by calculating our adjustment factor that we need 30 times the amount of each ingredient. So the final amount for our formulation would be 30 grams of ciprofloxacin mixed with 1,500 milliliters of propylene glycol. And then we will QS with glycerin up to a total final volume of 3,000 milliliters. And that's how we've now adjusted this formula for the batch size that we want to create. And that is the answer to this question. All right, let's move on to our next problem variation on this adjusting formulas, sizes, and I tried to find one that's a little more challenging. These are not very difficult, and hopefully you don't find them difficult. This one I think is made more difficult by using the term parts, and students hate parts. So let's show you that there's no reason to fear parts. So the question reads, how many grams of each ingredient would be needed to prepare 5 pounds of glycerogelatin containing the following parts by weight? Okay, so let's look at the prescription. It reads, we need zinc oxide 10 parts, along with gelatin 15 parts, glycerin 40 parts, and water 35 parts. So we have distinct relative quantities of each of our ingredients. We don't know exact weights, but we know relations of one to the other, and that's the idea of parts. Okay, so let's start this problem by first getting and defining how much we're actually trying to prepare. We have a general recipe for our batch. How much do we need? And it says we need to prepare 5 pounds. Well, I don't want to deal with pounds. Let's convert pounds to grams. So my first step would be to multiply my 5 pounds that I want to prepare times the conversion that there are 454 grams per pound, so that pounds cancel. I multiply that out, and what I'm really trying to prepare is 2,270 grams. That's the total weight. All right. My total weight will be 2,270 grams. My question to you, since the amounts of all of my ingredients are given in parts, I know the total weight. What would the total parts be? So because the total parts would be equivalent to the 2,270 that I want to make. So let's count the total number of parts, regardless of where they come from. So let's add everything up. So I have 10 parts for my zinc oxide, plus 15 for my gelatin, plus 40 for my glycerin, plus 35 for my water. If I just add up all those numbers, I get 100 parts total. All right. So I know I have 100 parts in my formula, and I now know what I want the 100 parts to represent is a total weight of 2,270 grams. So now I can calculate my adjustment factor by taking the amount that I want to prepare, which is the 2,270 grams, and dividing it by the amount specified in the formula, which, bear with me, it seems a little weird here, but we just said was 100 parts. We added it all up, and the total weight in the formula was 100 parts. So now I don't get a unitless number like I did previously. Now 2,270 grams divided by 100 parts equals 22.7 grams per part. My units don't cancel. So in this case, that's fine. It is still the adjustment factor that I'm going to need to use. So just like we did before, let's go ahead and apply that adjustment factor to each of our ingredients. So let's start with the zinc oxide. The prescription calls for 10 parts to be zinc oxide. We now know with our adjustment factor, for the batch that we want to make, we need each one part to be 22.7 grams. So let's multiply our 10 parts times that unit expressed as 22.7 grams per one part. That way the units of parts cancel, and 10 times 22.7 means for this batch that I need 227 grams of zinc oxide. Now you'll see this works exactly the same for each of the ingredients, so I'll try to go through this quickly. For glycerin, the prescription calls for 15 parts. Remember, we're going to be using the same adjustment factor for all of our ingredients, so 15 parts times 22.7 grams per part. Parts cancel, and we need 340.5 grams of our gelatin. Moving on to glycerin, we need 40 parts, therefore 40 parts times 22.7 grams per part means I need 908 grams of the glycerin. And lastly, water, I needed 35 parts, multiply that by the 22.7 grams per part, and I can see that I would need 794.5 grams of water, which since its density is 1, we can just say that's 794.5 milliliters of water. Okay, since we probably measure that by volume. Regardless, hopefully you saw how this works. It worked in the same way. The biggest difference here, when you express things by parts, you are naturally showing them in proportion of one to the other. So the biggest trick to that was knowing that since we had a total weight that we wanted to prepare, we needed to know the total number of parts. By taking the total weight divided by the total parts, that's how we were able to calculate the adjustment factor for this question, and that basically answers this question. All right, let's move on to the next chapter. Those that we've just completed the idea of adjusting formulas for different batch sizes, and we'll come back and revisit those, a couple of examples, but those are pretty straightforward. I think in a related way, let's though change our mind to this idea of the calculation of an active drug moiety. All right, so a little bit of background on terms, and then we'll hopefully use this table here to really bring home the idea of what we're trying to accomplish. Now, when you say drug, when you give somebody a drug, you want it to produce some sort of pharmacologic activity, okay? The term active moiety, when we say the moiety of a drug compound, that is the part of a drug compound that produces the pharmacologic effect. It's the part of the drug compound that produces a therapeutic response. It's why you're giving the drug. We would give a drug to somebody so that the active moiety of that drug could produce its effect. All right. Well, why is there anything other than a drug moiety? You think, well, why would you have anything other than just the active drug moiety? Well, the problem is an active drug moiety in itself chemically may not be soluble in water. It may not be able to be absorbed very well. It may not be able to be formulated into a dosage form that's easy to take. So what often has to happen is that a drug manufacturer takes their active drug moiety and intentionally alters it in a way, either forming a salt or an ester or some other complex chemical form, not to change its pharmacologic activity, but to change its solubility or to make it more absorbable or to make it in some form that won't degrade as quickly, so that the body can process it and get rid of the extra stuff and break it down back to just the active moiety, but that the body can initially deal with it or handle it into this more complex form so it can even be absorbed, or the drug could even be solubilized. Hopefully I didn't keep walking over my idea there, but hopefully that makes sense, is that we may have this pharmacologically active moiety that can't just exist by itself, or it couldn't get into the body. Therefore, let's change the moiety, add stuff to it to make it soluble, to make it absorbable, make it in a form the body can handle. Okay? And therefore, the question is this more complex drug compound. And so we're going to talk about this, the compound being the more complicated molecule that contains the active moiety inside of it. So the compound contains the moiety. Okay. So the question is, when we dose something, when we say how much of a drug is given, do we express it in the weight of the actual compound, which includes the other junk in there, or do we just express it in the terms of the active drug moiety provided by that amount of compound? Both. You will see it expressed both ways, and that's where a source of confusion comes in from students, especially when knowing how to express the weight of one in terms of the weight of the other. Because oftentimes what we in the end really need to know is the weight of the active moiety. But if we're not provided that actual moiety weight, then we need to be able to go from the compound down to just the moiety, or sometimes we got to go the other way. Even if we know what the active drug moiety is, we may not know the weight of the compound to actually dose to give that amount of moiety. So you have to go back and forth. So I keep saying compound and moiety. Let's give some examples here. And again, I love this table on the bottom here, because you can see, both the drug name, and I'll talk about the drug name here in a minute. You can see their empiric formula. And what I'm showing you in this empirical formula is the complicated C's and H's and all of those big numbers on the left are the moiety, and the dot shows you the other stuff added to the drug moiety to make it a formulation that we can actually administer. So, for example, hydrochloride is HCl, okay? Oxalate is CHO, and you can see the formulas there. So, anyways, you can kind of see the additional part of the compound added to the moiety. And then lastly, you can see the weight of the compound is heavier than the weight of the active drug moiety, or what is oftentimes referred to as the free base. Why is the compound heavier? Because it has all of the extra stuff added to it that's needed to formulate the drug, whereas the drug moiety is only a fraction, a proportion, and then we'll come back to this idea of a proportion of the overall weight. So some examples are cinacalcet isn't just cinacalcet, it's cinacalcet hydrochloride. Escitalopram, while that's the active moiety, escitalopram, it's actually formulated as the oxalate form of it. There's metoproteinol sulfate. there's mesylate, there's meliate, there's sumatriptan succinate. And different salts are required for different reasons, for different chemicals, based off of what the issue is to formulate it. And that's well beyond the scope of this course. What is important, the take-home messages, after all my rambling here, is the fact that your active drug moieties are often contained in a variety of different, more complicated compounds for the various reasons in terms of formulation. But in the end, the compound itself is larger. It can be slightly larger or a lot larger depending on the amount of extra stuff that had to be added to the moiety. But in the end, there's a proportion by weight. The active moiety will occupy some proportional weight of the compound. And with that as enough description, let's just answer some practice questions and apply this proportional weight into action. So our first question to illustrate these types of calculations reads, ferrous sulfate syrup contains 40 grams of ferrous sulfate with the formula FeSO4, and it's a heptahydrate, so times 7 H2O molecules. So the hydrated ferrous sulfate with a molecular weight of 274. That's the actual ingredient in this formulation, and there are 40 grams of that per 1,000 milliliters. And the question is, how many milligrams of just elemental iron, or Fe, with a molecular weight of 56, are represented by the usual dose of 10 milliliters of syrup? So we have a concentration expressed in ferrous sulfate per milliliter, but we want to know how many milligrams of elemental iron essentially in the dose of 10 milliliters. So we got to go from ferrous sulfate to elemental iron. Okay? So with all of these questions, we'll use this to highlight this procedure. The first step is to very clearly indicate to yourself what is the active drug moiety and what is the drug compound. Okay? So in this question, the moiety, the active agent in this is the elemental iron, or the Fe, and we'll abbreviate that Fe. So elemental iron is the moiety. The compound is represented by the ferrous sulfate, and I'll just abbreviate that Fs. Okay? Moiety is iron, compound is ferrous sulfate. All right? So what we're going to need to do is start with the amount of ferrous sulfate in our 10 milliliter dose, and then eventually convert that to an equivalent amount of elemental iron, or the moiety. We've got to go from the dose in compound to the equivalent dose of the moiety. So let's start by calculating the weight of the compound in milligrams in our 10 milliliter dose. All right. So we'll start with the fact that the dose is 10 milliliters, and we'll multiply it by its concentration. We were given its concentration as having 40 grams of ferrous sulfate per every 1,000 milliliters. Okay, so if I multiply this way, milliliters cancel, and I will be in grams of ferrous sulfate. But I want to know my dose in milligrams. So let's multiply that by the fact that there's 1,000 milligrams for every 1 gram, so that grams cancel, and my final units would be in milligrams. So if I do that math from left to right all the way over, my resulting answer would be 400, and that represents 400 milligrams of ferrous sulfate. Okay? Now, this is the trick. How do we go from the weight of the ferrous sulfate to the equivalent weight of just the active moiety iron? Okay, we do that by setting up a proportion. And I will tell you to set this proportion up in the same order each time to avoid mistakes. So what I recommend, and it's not like you'd have to do this way, but I think it makes sense to set the weight of the moiety over the weight of the compound. And when I say weight, I mean the molecular weight. So let's take the molecular weight of the iron, which was the moiety. That's why it's very clear. You need to very clearly identify what's the moiety versus what's the compound. In this case, we said the moiety is iron. So let's take the molecular weight of the iron, which was 56, and set that over the molecular weight of the compound, which we said was the ferrous sulfate heptahydrate and had a molecular weight of 278. Do you see we are setting up a proportion? We're saying is that the weight of the moiety would be 56 out of the proportional weight of the larger compound, which is 278. Okay? So now that we've set up the proportion of the weight of the moiety over the weight of the compound. We can set that equal to some unknown weight of the moiety over the weight of the compound that I know that I have in my dose, which was 400 milligrams. I know I get 400 milligrams of the ferrous sulfate with every dose. So now I can solve for X, which would be the proportional amount of iron, or just the moiety within that dose. So if I solve for X by cross-multiplying and dividing, I would get a numeric answer of 80.6, and the units would be milligrams of the moiety, milligrams of iron. So setting up the correct proportion of the molecular weights of the moiety over the compound allows me to solve really for either one that I'm looking for when I know the other. In this case, I knew the compound. I knew I had 400 milligrams of the compound. So when I solve for X here, the resulting units are also in milligrams, and my number would be 80.6. So 400 milligrams of ferrous sulfate in this solution as the heptahydrate provides 80.6 milligrams of pure or elemental iron. All right, well, let's try another variation of these same sorts of calculations. And this problem reads, how many grams of epinephrine bitartrate with a molecular weight of 333 should be used in preparing 500 milliliters of an ophthalmic solution containing the equivalent of 2% weight per volume of just epinephrine? And that molecular weight is 183. Okay, good example. So our moiety is epinephrine, and our compound is epinephrine bitartrate. So that's really important. The first thing we want to establish is which one is the moiety, epinephrine, and I'm going to abbreviate that just as a capital E. And our compound is epinephrine bitartrate, which I'll abbreviate EB. Okay, so the first step would be to calculate the amount of moiety that we need in the actual ophthalmic solution. So the ophthalmic solution calls for the preparation of 500 milliliters, and the concentration of that solution needs to be 2% weight per volume of the moiety, which is just capital E, or epinephrine. So let's take 500 mils times its concentration and 2% weight per volume, means 2 grams of epinephrine for every 100 milliliters of this solution. So if we multiply that out, 500 times 2 grams divided by 100 milliliters, milliliters cancel, and we see that to prepare this ophthalmic solution, we need 10 grams of the moiety epinephrine. All right. So now all we need to do is to determine the equivalent weight of the compound epinephrine bitartrate. To do that, let's set up our ratio of moiety over compound. So the formula weight of our moiety, again, epinephrine, is 183. And let's set that over the molecular weight of the compound, which we said was epinephrine bitartrate, which had a molecular weight of 333. So our proportion essentially is 183 for moiety over 333 for compound. Now, using that proportion, we can set that equal to what we know, what we just calculated, is that we want the equivalent weight to 10 grams of the epinephrine moiety. So let's put 10 grams on top for the moiety over X. Now when we solve for X, we will find the equivalent weight of the compound. So if we solve for X, 10 times 333 divided by 183, numerically, we should get 18.2, and the units on that from the moiety was grams, so it would be 18.2 grams, and that would now represent the weight of the epinephrine bitartrate, or of the compound needed to provide the 10 grams of pure drug, or in this case of the pure epinephrine moiety. So hopefully you are starting to get a feel for setting up the steps are to set up, first of all, what's the name of your moiety? What's the name of your compound? Determine the weight of the one that you have, either the moiety or the compound, and then use the proportion to solve for the other. And again, get used to always setting up your proportion as the molecular weight of the moiety over the molecular weight of the compound equal to the weight of the moiety over the weight of the compound. And you can solve for whichever one of those two that you don't have. All right, our next problem I think just highlights it works the same way, and hopefully you'll see these are fairly straightforward as well. It's a proportion. It's a ratio of one weight to the other. But establishing which weight is which can be confusing. This is a good example of needing to list out your specific products, moieties, and compounds. So let's read the question. It says, 500 grams of effervescent sodium phosphate contain 100 grams of anhydrous dibasic sodium phosphate with the formula Na2HPO4 and a molecular weight of 142. How many grams of dibasic sodium phosphate heptahydrate with the formula given there and a molecular weight of 268 are represented in each 10-gram dose of the effervescent sodium phosphate? Wow, that does seem confusing. We got three things going on, three names. We've got two molecular weights, different structures. And so where do we start? We start by labeling the names of each of our specific chemicals or compounds. All right. So what I want to do is I'm going to call the product, essentially the formulation product that we are making is an effervescent sodium phosphate product. So I'm going to abbreviate that as ESP for effervescent sodium phosphate. Okay. Well, inside of that product, we know the active moiety was this anhydrous dibasic sodium phosphate, which I will abbreviate ASP for anhydrous dibasic sodium phosphate. Okay. So that's the active ingredient in the effervescent sodium phosphate. All right. Now, the problem is, or the issue is, that moiety is contained within a larger compound. The anhydrous dibasic sodium phosphate is found within the dibasic sodium phosphate heptahydrate. So the compound is the dibasic sodium phosphate heptahydrate, which I will abbreviate as SPHH for sodium phosphate heptahydrate. Okay? So the product effervescent sodium phosphate contains an active moiety, anhydrous dibasic sodium phosphate. That active moiety is obtained from the compound dibasic sodium phosphate heptahydrate. Okay? Now I will use the abbreviations for everyone's sanity going forward now. So, where do we start? Well, let's start by calculating the weight of the active moiety. The active moiety is derived from the weight of the product. So we were told that we want to know how much, essentially, is found in a 10-gram dose of the effervescent sodium phosphate. So let's start with a 10-gram dose of the ESP. Okay? What do we know about that ESP? We were told that 500 grams of ESP contains 100 grams of ASP. All right. So let's multiply it by the fact that we could say on top you get 100 grams of ASP for every 500 grams of ESP. Okay. So if we start with a 10-gram dose of that, if we multiply that across, grams of ESP cancel, and we're left with grams of the ASP or the anhydrous dibasic sodium phosphate. So if we do that math, 10 times 100 divided by 500, we get 2 grams. We get 2 grams of ASP in this 10-gram dose of ESP. So now all we're really trying to find out is how many grams of our compound, our SPHH, does it take to provide 2 grams of our active moiety, ASP? Well, that's easy. We're just going to set up the ratio of their molecular weights. So the molecular weight of the moiety, the ASP, was 142. And remember, we always put moiety over compound. So let's put 142, that represents the moiety, over the molecular weight of the compound, which was the SPHH at 268. So 142 over 268 should be equal to, in this case, we have the weight of the moiety. We have 2 grams of the ASP weight, which is the moiety, so 2 grams over X. Solving for X, we would get the weight in grams of the compound needed to provide 2 grams of moiety. So solving for X, we see that X would equal, numerically, 3.78. And the units on that would be grams. And that represents the weight of the compound, and the SPHH, or the dibasic sodium phosphate heptahydrate, which is the compound. We know we need 3.78 grams of that compound to provide 2 grams of ASP, which is the moiety, and that's the amount of moiety contained in 10 grams of our product, which was the effervescent sodium phosphate. So hopefully you were able, and I just worked us backwards from our answer. Hopefully you see the step-by-step through this. This is not complicated math. What's complicated is understanding what are my products, what's my moiety, what's my compound, and making sure you solve for the correct thing that you're searching for. In this case, the question wanted to know how much of the compound was represented in the 10-gram dose, and the final answer to that was 3.78 grams. All right, let's move on to our next example, and I need to wake you up here at this point because this one's tricky. This one is a much harder question. Even though a lot of the math is the same, there's a fundamental difference here. So let's see if you can handle this question. It is definitely got a little bit of a trick to it. So let's read the question. It says, the formula for Albright's solution M calls for 8.84 grams of anhydrous sodium carbonate with the formula Na2CO3 and a molecular weight of 106. It needs 8.84 grams of that per 1,000 milliliters. Okay, that's the formula. What the question is asking is how many grams of a 95% weight per weight sodium hydroxide powder should be used to replace the anhydrous sodium carbonate in preparing 5 liters of solution. So instead of using the anhydrous sodium carbonate, we want to use sodium hydroxide. And what we have, the form of sodium hydroxide, which has a formula of NaOH and a molecular weight of 40, we have a powder that's 95% weight per weight sodium hydroxide. Okay? There's a lot of stuff going on here, but hopefully you understand the overall objective. Let's replace the sodium carbonate with the sodium hydroxide. So what's an equivalent amount that we would need in order to prepare 5 liters of solution? So once again, let's list our compounds, okay? And this is going to be important. We do not necessarily have an active moiety here. This is kind of a little bit of the variation. We have one compound being anhydrous sodium carbonate, and the formulas here are important. Be sure and look at this. And the formula for that is Na2CO3. The other compound that we want to replace compound 1 with is compound 2, which is sodium hydroxide, which is NaOH. All right. Now, when we replace one with the other, what is the point of this? This is where a little bit of the trick comes in. Why would you want sodium carbonate powder or sodium hydroxide powder? To provide sodium. Sodium is the key ingredient that's the same in both the sodium carbonate and the sodium hydroxide. So when we replace the sodium carbonate with the sodium hydroxide, we need to replace the same amount of sodium. And that's why the molecular formula gets to be important here. Because what you're seeing is to get an equivalent amount of sodium, to replace the one molecule with the other and still provide the same amount of sodium, looking at the chemical formulas, we see that 1 sodium carbonate provides 2 sodiums because the formula is Na2CO3. So 1 sodium carbonate molecule provides 2 sodiums. Therefore, if you look on the denominator there, it takes 2 sodium hydroxides, since sodium hydroxide only has 1 sodium per sodium hydroxide molecule. It takes 2 sodium hydroxide molecules to equal 1 sodium carbonate molecule, since that molecule actually provides 2 sodiums. Okay? In both cases, to provide 2 sodiums, we need 1 sodium carbonate molecule, but we need 2 sodium hydroxide molecules. That's an important different factor here, since the one chemical is replacing the other. In order to replace the sodium, we must account for that. And you'll see where we do that here in a minute. Okay? So, where do we keep going from this? Well, let's start with what we're trying to prepare. We want to make essentially 5,000 milliliters. Okay? 5,000 milliliters of this solution. Okay? Now, the original solution calls for sodium carbonate at a concentration of 8.84 grams per 1,000 milliliters. So, if we were going to make the formula the way it is, if we made Albright's using the sodium carbonate, how much sodium carbonate will we need? So, let's take our 5,000 milliliters that we want to prepare times that concentration of 8.84 grams of sodium carbonate per 1,000 milliliters. Milliliters will cancel, and we would end up in grams of sodium carbonate. So to make our 5 liters, we need 44.2 grams of sodium carbonate. But this is where we want to replace it. We don't want to use 44.2 grams of sodium carbonate. The important question is, what would be an equivalent amount of sodium hydroxide to replace the sodium from the sodium carbonate? So let's set up our molecular weights. Let's set up our proportions. So on top, we're going to have what was originally called for in the formula, which was sodium carbonate, and its molecular weight of 106. Down below there, we're going to put the molecular weight of what we're replacing it with, which is sodium hydroxide, which we said was 40. So up to now, this is the same thing we've done before. We've set a ratio or a proportion of molecular weights. In this case, sodium carbonate on top with 106 over 40, which is the sodium hydroxide. But notice, we need to multiply the value of 40 for the sodium hydroxide times 2, because it takes 2 sodium hydroxides to replace the same number of sodiums that you get from 1 sodium carbonate. So that's why, remember, we said the equivalent weight we need for every 1 molecule of sodium carbonate, we need 2 molecules of sodium hydroxide. So if the molecular weight of 1 sodium carbonate is 106, we have to divide that by the equivalent amount of sodium hydroxide, which is its molecular weight, but times 2, because it would take 2 of those to equal the 1 sodium carbonate. Okay? So hopefully you understand that proportion. Now that we have that proportion, we can set it equal to what we have, or what we know, which is that we want the equivalent amount of 44.2 grams of sodium carbonate. So we'll put that in the numerator, since sodium carbonate is on top, 44.2 grams of sodium carbonate over some value x. And x would be the equivalent weight in grams of the sodium hydroxide. So to solve for x, what we have to do is take our 40 molecular weight of sodium hydroxide times 2, which is 80, take 80 times the 44.2, and then divide by the 106. So if you solve that math for x, we see the equivalent amount of sodium hydroxide we would need would be 33.4. That accounts for both the difference in the molecular weights and the differences in the amount of sodium between the two products. So that's why the equivalent weight for sodium hydroxide is 33.4 grams, would be the same amount of sodium as 44.2 grams of our sodium carbonate. So now we know the weight of the sodium hydroxide we need. The last step is to account for the fact that we are using a 95% weight per weight powder to provide it. So let's take our desired weight of pure sodium hydroxide, which is the 33.4 grams, and multiply it by the weight of the powder, expressed as, for every 100 grams of this powder, it contains 95 grams of sodium hydroxide. That's the 95% weight per weight. The grams of sodium hydroxide cancel, and we would end up with grams of the sodium hydroxide powder we need, which would be the 35.2 grams of sodium hydroxide mixture powder to provide the amount of sodium hydroxide we need to be equivalent to the amount we would have needed of sodium carbonate. So that's a little bit of a long, convoluted question. It goes to show all the permutations that can occur, but in the end, a key step was determining the actual weight of the sodium hydroxide equivalent to the sodium carbonate, and there we had to use both the molecular weights and the equivalent amount of sodium from the two different molecules to get the right number. All right, let's move on to our next question. Now, I don't think it's near as difficult as the previous one, but I think it's more clinically relevant and more applicable to the variety of different dosage forms that you will see sometimes for the same active drug moiety. So I thought a great example of that would be diclofenac. So let's read the question. It says, calculate the weight in milligrams of the active drug moiety diclofenac, which has a molecular weight of 295.13, delivered by each of the commercial products based on each of those products' maximum daily dose. So, a little bit of background. It's kind of interesting. So, diclofenac is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug that's used for inflammation and pain relief, obviously. And it actually it's an interesting drug because it comes in a variety of different dosage forms. And with each dosage forms, there's a different brand name. So, for example, it comes under the brand name Cataflam 50 milligram tablets. The generic for that is diclofenac potassium. So, and I don't know the rationale behind it, but obviously to formulate this drug into a tablet that can dissolve and be released within the stomach, the best formulation of the active moiety diclofenac is to pair it up with potassium. And again, those are in 50 milligram tablets. Now let's compare that to when that same active moiety diclofenac is formulated in Voltaren 1% topical gel. To apply that topically in a gel format, they use diclofenac moiety along with a sodium molecule. Okay? And that's different than the product Flector, which takes the active moiety diclofenac and mixes it with a salt I've never heard of, epolamine. And that diclofenac epolamine is the form that's needed to put it in a 1.3% topical patch. So while it's still being used topical, it's not a gel anymore. It's actually within this patch. And all of these different variations of the diclofenac are used to alleviate pain and discomfort at the site, but it's formulated very differently. So let's go through, and you can see that the numbers and the strengths are very different, and the actual daily amounts for each dosage form is different. Let's see if we can actually calculate the amount of active moiety that the patient would be delivered in each of these different dosage forms. Okay, so let's start with the Cataflam tablets. So if we start with the Cataflam 50 milligram tablets, we see that the maximum daily dose is 1 tablet every 8 hours. So if we take a daily dose, we would take 50 milligrams times the fact that every 24 divided by 8 is 3. So there are 3 doses per day when you dose something every 8 hours. So 50 milligrams times 3 doses per day gives us 150 milligrams per day. Okay. Well, that is the expression, if you will, of the compound. That is the weight of the diclofenac potassium is the 150 milligrams. So I guess my question to you is, actually, how much of the active moiety just diclofenac is that person getting each day? Well, this is easy now. You've got this skill. Well, let's set up the ratio of the formula weight of the moiety over the formula weight of the compound. We were given in the first part of the question that the active moiety diclofenac has a formula weight of 295.13. So let's set that over then the molecular weight of the diclofenac potassium, which we were given to be 334.25. Then we can set that equal to some value x, which is, again, the weight of the moiety contained in 150 milligrams of the compound. And the 150 milligrams is what we calculated to be the maximum daily dose of the compound. So solving for x, we can see that the 150 milligrams of the compound provides only 132 milligrams per day of the diclofenac moiety. All right, so that's easy. Let's compare that to what happens with Voltaren when it's dosed as a topical gel. So the Voltaren 1% topical gel, it says the maximum daily dose is 32 grams per day applied to all joints, which would be your knee, your elbow, wherever you've got the pain and soreness that you're treating. So if 32 grams per day is the total per day, then to calculate the weight of the diclofenac sodium provided by that, we actually have to factor in its concentration, which is 1%. So 32 grams times 1% weight per volume, would be 1 gram of diclofenac sodium per 100 grams of the gel. So, and then to convert that to milligrams, let's multiply grams by 1,000 milligrams per gram so the grams cancel. And if we multiply that across, we can see that the 32 grams of gel per day of a 1% gel is equivalent to providing 320 milligrams of diclofenac sodium. How much moiety is in that? Well, let's take the molecular weight of our moiety, 295.13, set it over the molecular weight of our compound, which is 318.13. Set that equal to some unknown x of the moiety over the weight of the compound per day, which we said was 320 milligrams. And now when we multiply and solve for x, we see that we're exposing this patient on a daily basis to actually 295 milligrams of the active moiety. Okay? Lastly, let's do the same thing for the patch. The Flector 1.3% topical patch has a maximum daily dose of 1 patch every 12 hours. So we would put 2 patches on per day. And it says that each patch contains 180 milligrams of diclofenac epolamine. Now, we were also going to assume that 100% of the drug is released, which is a bit of an assumption here, but bear with me. So let's calculate the maximum daily dose you could get of diclofenac epolamine out of these patches. So let's take the fact that we do 2 patches per day times the fact that you get 180 milligrams per patch. So 180 times 2 means we would be getting 360 milligrams of diclofenac epolamine per day from the patch. How much active moiety? Well, let's take our 295.13 molecular weight for the moiety over the molecular weight of the diclofenac epolamine, which we were given at 411.3. So if we set up that ratio and set that to equal to X over what we're getting on a daily basis, which was 360 milligrams, now we again solve for X. And we see that in using the patch at its maximum daily dose, we get 258 milligrams of the active moiety diclofenac. So the take-home message is to show you that in commercial products, oftentimes you can have the same drug either dosed as the moiety or dosed as the compound. And in sometimes you have to go from one dosage form to another dosage form of the same active moiety, but on those dosage forms, if they are formulated differently, then they're going to have different salts or different formulations with different molecular weights. But you can set up this same procedure of the moiety over the compound, setting those molecular weights up to be able to proportion and solve for whichever one you still need. So I thought this was a good example of showing you 3 different ways of being able to, again, solve for the moiety when we have differing amounts of the actual compound. Well, we've made it to the last question. Now, there are multiple parts to this question, but we are on a last question. And I like this one. It's going to tie together a lot of what we've been doing in this entire lecture. So let's read the question. The question really starts with this formula. We have a prescription. We have a recipe, a formulation that calls for glycolic acid at 5 grams to be mixed with lactic acid, 5 grams, citric acid, 2 grams, and tartaric acid, 2 grams, and enough of the acetyl alcohol emulsion to give it some stiffness in semi-solid form, essentially 60 grams, and enough water so that when you add all of those grams up, and we basically have a total amount of 100 milliliters. Okay, and this is kind of a skincare. I show you a good example of this type of product down below in the little bottle on the lower right. This is kind of a skin softener, skin exfoliating, take off the top layer of skin and hydrate the skin, so it'll kind of get rid of rough, damaged skin. So we've got a formula for that, and it basically is enough to produce a 100 milliliter bottle by the time that we follow through with this formula. Okay, so part 1 of this question says, how many of each ingredient is needed for 8 60 milliliter bottles? So we want to make a batch. We want to prepare 8 bottles, and each bottle contains 60 milliliters. So the first question is, how much of each ingredient do we need to do? Well, first step is to determine the total volume. What is the total amount we need for this batch? We want 8 bottles times the fact that there are 60 milliliters per bottle. We want to prepare a total of 480 milliliters. And that volume is clearly larger than the 100 milliliters called for in the formula or the recipe. So let's calculate our adjustment factor. I'll remind you, our adjustment factor is simply the amount we want to prepare, that is the desired amount, divided by the standard amount in the formula. So in this example, we want to prepare 480 milliliters, but the formula only calls for a total up to 100 milliliters. So let's divide that by 100 milliliters. So 480 mils divided by 100 mils, mils cancel, and we get an adjustment factor of 4.8. Simply now, but repetitive, we need to apply that adjustment factor to each of our ingredients. And this is where, again, we need to be very careful with our units. So I've rewritten the formula here, and I won't maybe read through all of these, or I'll try to do it quickly. We would take, for example, glycolic acid, which called for 5 grams, times 4.8. Adjustment factor means we need 24 grams. Likewise for lactic acid. For citric acid, we need 2 grams, but we need to multiply that by its, again, the adjustment factor of 4.8, meaning we need 9.6 grams of citric acid. And again, the same for the tartaric acid. For the acetyl alcohol emulsion, it called for 60 grams. 60 grams times our adjustment factor of 4.8 means we actually need 288 grams of the acetyl alcohol emulsion. And lastly, we need enough water. up to 100 milliliters in the standard formula. So let's multiply that by our adjustment factor of 4.8, which now means in our new formula, we need to add enough water up to a total volume of 480 milliliters. So hopefully this was a good review of the first part of chapter that we talked about, where we talked about adjusting formulas. So that's what we've done with this first part to this question. Part 2 of this question goes on a little bit more about the lactic acid. And it says, lactic acid is available only as an 88% weight per weight solution with a specific gravity of 1.21. How many milliliters of lactic acid would be needed to prepare the amount required for the 8 60 milliliter bottles? Okay, so now let's see here. We need to remember what our formula was. So we said for the lactic acid, to make our batch, we needed a total of 24 grams. So let's start with the 24 grams, which is a weight of lactic acid. The solution we're using here, you can kind of see in this picture here, I love this little mermaid bottle of lactic acid, 88%. It kind of tells you it's a gentle facial peel. I'm not sure 88% lactic acid is super gentle, but the fact that you're trying to descale a mermaid is kind of clever, I think. So anyways, this is basically a keratolytic to help remove some of the top layer of skin. Going back to the question here, we wanted 24 grams of this. That solution is 88% weight per weight, meaning there's 88 grams of lactic acid for 100 grams of lactic acid solution. So let's multiply it by the fact that there'd be 100 grams of lactic acid solution over 88 grams of pure lactic acid. That way grams of lactic acid cancel. And now we're in the weight of this solution. However, we don't want to measure it by weight. We want to measure it by volume. So let's use the specific gravity. We'll multiply it by it expressed as for every 1 milliliter, there would contain 1.21 grams. Now, grams of lactic acid solution cancel, and we would be in milliliters. So if you do that math, starting from left to right, your final answer should be 22.5 milliliters. That's the volume of lactic acid you would need of this solution that would provide exactly 24 grams of pure lactic acid. All right, let's move on to part 3 of this question, and it says, you have on hand to use to compound this product citric acid monohydrate. But the prescription actually calls for citric acid anhydrous. So the question is, how many grams of the citric acid monohydrate do you need to use to compound this 80 60 milliliter bottle batch? So to make this batch, how much of the citric acid monohydrate do you need when the prescription actually calls for citric acid anhydrous? Okay, so first step in these is let's list what's the moiety versus what's the compound. In this example, the moiety is the anhydrous citric acid. It's the citric acid without the water molecule. On the other hand, what we have on hand is the compound, which is the citric acid, but with it combined with a water molecule. Okay, so the compound is the monohydrate. The moiety is the citric acid anhydrous. Okay, so what we're wanting to do is that we know how much the prescription calls for. We've calculated how much of the moiety we need. What we need to know is how much of our actual compound to use to provide that. So let's set up our ratios. And again, we always set moiety over compound. So again, if you look at the formula weights, the anhydrous formula weight is 192.12. That's the moiety. Let's set that over the compound molecular weight, which was 210.14. Okay, we'll set that equal to that. If you go back, what we calculated with our adjustment factor for our batch, we needed 9.6 grams of the anhydrous citric acid. So we'll set that on top for the moiety, 9.6 grams of moiety over X. And solving for X will be in the units of grams, and it will be the grams of the compound we need. So if we solve for X and do that math, you get numerically 10.5, and that represents grams of the compound, which was grams of the citric acid monohydrate, which answers essentially part 3 of this question. So last question, last part would be part 4, which says, the limit of arsenic in citric acid monohydrate set by the USP is not more than 3 ppm by weight. What does ppm stand for? 3 parts per million by weight. What is the maximum amount of arsenic in micrograms that could be contained in the citric acid monohydrate calculated in the previous part? Okay, so this is just kind of a review type question. that has to do with your concentrations amount. So remember, we just calculated that we need to use 10.5 grams of citric acid monohydrate. So let's start with, and I'll abbreviate that as Ca for citric acid monohydrate. So citric acid, 10.5 grams of that times. Well, how much arsenic could we be getting? It said 3 ppm, which stands for parts per million. So we could change those units to 3 grams of arsenic per 1 million grams of citric acid. 3 parts per million, if we keep it in the units of grams, as a weight per weight, and it did say by weight, so that means 3 grams arsenic per 1 million grams of citric acid. That's a big number, but stay calm, no big deal, because if we multiply by our 10.5 grams of citric acid cancel, and we're now in grams of arsenic. And all it wanted, though, was to express that amount of arsenic in micrograms. And again, you can convert that all at one time. I like to do it in steps. So I'm going to take my grams of arsenic and multiply it by 1,000 milligrams per gram, so that grams cancel and I'm in milligrams. Then I know to convert milligrams to multiply that by 1,000 micrograms per milligram. That way milligrams cancel, and now I'm finally in micrograms. So if you do that math all the way from left to right all the way over, you should get a value of 31.5, and your final units would be in micrograms of arsenic. Okay, and with that somewhat unpleasant thought of arsenic, that's the end of this lecture. So hopefully you found it helpful. And again, can really kind of see the relationship between adjusting formulas, and remembering the key part to that was the adjustment factor of taking the desired amount divided by the standard amount and then multiplying everything by that factor. That's a proportion. The desired amount over the standard amount is a proportion. That was related to the other activity of being able to formulate an amount of drug moiety from a compound, or the amount of a compound from a drug moiety. And again, that's a proportion. You use the molecular weights of the moiety molecular weight over the compound molecular weight. That proportion can help you solve those questions. So hopefully you found this useful.